The air in the dining room was thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of expensive polish and my father's overwhelming self-satisfaction. It was my 18th birthday, and the atmosphere felt less like a celebration and more like a corporate annual review. I sat rigidly, trying to look appreciative of the imported crystal centerpiece, while battling the familiar, suffocating pressure of expectation. This house, Richard's house, was not a home. It was a perfectly calibrated machine of status, built of polished mahogany, imported marble, and silent, judgmental walls. Every object, from the antique silver serving spoons to the original oil paintings that lined the long hallway, served as a constant, tangible reminder of the wealth I was expected to inherit and, more importantly, never jeopardize. Under Richard's roof, success was measured in square footage and quarterly returns. Anything less was simply failure. I had spent 18 years feeling small here, always under the scrutiny of his gaze. Richard, seated at the head of the impossibly long table, held court over the small gathering of my mother, who remained a beautiful, passive fixture, and a few of his business partners. He was discussing his latest real estate conquest, a development in the foothills that promised exponential returns. His voice was smooth, deep, and utterly confident, the sound of a man who believed the world was meticulously arranged for his benefit. "The key," he boomed, gesturing with a glass of Bordeaux, "is recognizing where the true leverage lies. It's about capital, Sarah, not sentiment. Sentiment is for the weak." I nodded vaguely, the words barely registering. My stomach was churning, a tight knot of nerves and defiance. For months, I had carried the secret, the signed papers tucked away in a folder that felt heavier than any textbook. I had agonized over the timing, rehearsing the conversation countless times in the lonely silence of my museum-like bedroom. Tonight was the night I had turned 18. I was legally free, even if emotionally trapped. I waited for a lull in the conversation, after the dessert plates had been cleared and before the expensive brandy was poured. The moment was sharp and crystalline, suspended between courses. I took a deep breath, the scent of the dying lilies on the table momentarily overpowering the fear. "Father," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. He paused mid-sentence, annoyed by the interruption. His blue eyes, usually sharp and assessing, narrowed slightly. "Yes, Sarah. Did you wish to thank Mr. Peterson for the I won't be taking the spot at Georgetown next fall?" I interrupted, pushing the words out before I could lose my nerve. A beat of silence, my mother shifted nervously. Richard simply raised an eyebrow, a gesture that managed to convey both impatience and superiority. "We've been over this. Georgetown is non-negotiable. It leads directly to the kind of career you need." "What are you talking about?" I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer, pulling out the folded document. It was crisp, official, and utterly alien to the world of polished wood and passive income that surrounded us. I placed the paper squarely on the white linen tablecloth, right next to his empty dessert plate. "I've signed the enlistment papers," I stated clearly, meeting his gaze head-on. "I'm joining the Navy." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. It was as if I had thrown a bucket of ice water across the table. The smooth veneer of Richard's composure shattered. The smile that had been plastered on his face, moments before the smile of a man who owned everything, dropped away, replaced by a look of sheer, visceral contempt. It was the most honest expression I had ever seen from him. "You did what asterisk?" he asked, the volume dangerously low, forcing the business partners at the table to look away awkwardly. "I enlisted," I repeated, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my voice remaining steady. "I ship out for basic training in 6 weeks." He didn't touch the papers. He didn't even lean in to read them. He simply stared at me, his face turning a blotchy red. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until he finally spoke, his words delivered like razor blades designed to cut deep. "This is an embarrassment," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "A pathetic, irresponsible retreat. You throw away a guaranteed future, an education that costs more than most people earn in a decade, for a uniform and a meager paycheck." The heat of humiliation flooded my cheeks. I felt the familiar burn of tears threatening, but I fought them back. I would not cry here. I would not give him that satisfaction. "It's not a retreat," I argued, gripping the edge of my chair. "It's structure. It's purpose. It's service." He laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound that vibrated with sneering contempt. "Purpose? Service? That is the language of those without real ambition, Sarah. The military is a refuge for losers, for those incapable of navigating the real world. It's where people go when they can't make it on their own merit." He picked up the enlistment. papers with the tips of his fingers, as if they were contaminated waste, and dropped them back onto the table. You think you're being noble? You're being willfully stupid. You're choosing a life of glorified poverty, clinging to a government paycheck because you lack the courage to build your own empire. His words struck with surgical precision, targeting my deepest insecurities, the ones he had cultivated since childhood. He mocked the very foundation of my decision, reducing my commitment to honor and duty to a financial failure. He kept hammering the point, circling it like a redditor. You'll be scraping by on a few $1,000s a month, relying on benefits and handouts, while your peers are closing deals and shaping markets. That military pension you think you're earning? It's a joke. A pathetic, guaranteed minimum for those too weak to demand the maximum. I pushed back against the wave of his scorn. I want to earn my own way, Richard. I don't want your charity or your leveraged debt. That phrase, asterisk, your leveraged debt, asterisk, seemed to ignite the final explosion. His eyes flashed, and he slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. This is my debt. This is asterisk, my asterisk success. And this house, this life you are so eager to dismiss, is the symbol of what it means to win. He stood up, towering over me, his face contorted. If you choose that loser's path, that path of mediocrity and cheap government security, then you cannot stay in asterisk my asterisk house. You will not embarrass me with your pitiful choices. The ultimatum hung in the air, cold and definitive. He was giving me a choice, his money and his approval, or my dignity and the Navy. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping harshly against the polished marble floor, shattering the last pretense of civility. I didn't hesitate. The choice had been made months ago when I signed those papers. Then I guess I won't be staying, I said, my voice tight but unwavering. I didn't pack a suitcase. I grabbed the pre-packed duffel bag I had hidden in the coat closet near the front entrance, the one containing the few items I truly valued, including my passport and the enlistment papers I retrieved from the table. My mother made a small, choked sound, but Richard was already striding toward the front door, his jaw clenched, demanding that I leave immediately. He didn't touch me, but the force of his anger was physical, propelling me forward. I walked out of the opulent, suffocating warmth and onto the cool, manicured sidewalk of the wealthy suburb. The heavy oak front door, a monument to his perceived permanence, slammed shut behind me with a sickening finality. The sound echoed in the quiet street, a sharp, violent punctuation mark on the end of my childhood. I stood there, 18 years old, alone, the cold autumn air immediately biting at my exposed skin. My duffel bag lay at my feet, containing everything I owned that mattered. I looked back at the house, bathed in the soft glow of security lights. It was vast, silent, and utterly indifferent. The weight of his rejection settled on me, a crushing, intended humiliation, meant to break my spirit and force me back, begging for his forgiveness and his money. He wanted me to stand there and realize I had made a terrible mistake, that I was incapable of survival outside his gilded cage. But as I stood on the sidewalk, shivering slightly, a different emotion began to rise through the cold. It wasn't despair. It was fierce, molten resolve. He had called me a loser. He had mocked my future, my dedication, and the value of service. He had used his house, his wealth, and his contempt as a weapon to destroy my self-worth. I looked down at my feet. I was free. And in that moment, staring up at the imposing facade of the house he had banished me from, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would build a life so strong, so secure, and so anchored in genuine achievement that Richard's contempt would never, ever touch me again. I would earn my way, on my own terms, with the very loser paycheck he had so gleefully insulted. And one day, I would prove that the true measure of a man or a woman was not the size of their portfolio, but the depth of their character. I picked up the duffel bag and started walking toward the only future I could truly call my own. The moment the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, the cold air of the suburban night seemed to solidify the end of my past. I stood on the sidewalk, my single duffel bag at my feet, and looked back at the house, a fortress of polished mahogany and inherited arrogance. Richard wanted me to feel the crushing weight of his rejection, but, standing there, shivering slightly under the glow of the street lamp, I felt something else entirely: release. I took his intended insult, the loser's path, and held it like a mantra. That path was now the only one I would walk. I found the nearest recruiting office the next morning, my 18th birthday, still heavy in the air, and signed the final papers. I didn't look back. The structure of the Navy was instantly, intensely liberating. For 18 years, my life had been dictated by Richard's need for control. His obsession with status symbols, and the stifling pressure to conform to his definition of success. Here, there was only the uniform, the schedule, and the mission. I didn't need to worry about the cost of my clothes or the right wine pairing. I worried about competence, teamwork, and execution. The discipline he scorned, I craved. It stripped away the superficiality of my childhood and replaced it with tangible purpose. Boot camp was a crucible, forging me into something unbreakable. I learned that true respect wasn't inherited. It was earned through sweat, precision, and the willingness to carry more than my own weight. I excelled in the technical training that followed, absorbing complex engineering principles with an intensity I hadn't known I possessed. My brain, which Richard had insisted was only suited for marrying into wealth, proved to be sharp and analytical. I quickly climbed the ranks. My first promotion felt monumental, not because of the modest pay increase, but because the stripes on my sleeve were undeniable proof of merit. Every commendation, every positive evaluation, was a direct contradiction to the narrative my father had spent a lifetime crafting about me. I wasn't a retreat. I was an advance. I wasn't a failure. I was a functioning, essential part of a high-performing unit. As the years passed, the geographical distance grew, but I made sure the emotional link, however toxic, remained active strictly for my own purposes. I needed the fuel. I made a point of sending updates home. Not out of longing, but out of calculated necessity. I mailed glossy official photos of myself in my dress, whites from deployments in the Pacific. I sent announcements of my advancements, detailing the new responsibilities I held. Richard's replies were always the same: curt, dismissive, and delivered via cold email. Never a handwritten letter. Asterisk Sarah, I see you've made Chief Petty Officer. That's nice. Have you finally thought about getting a real job in property management? You need to stop clinging to that meager paycheck. You're wasting your potential. Asterisk or, after I completed a demanding specialty course, asterisk the military is a wonderful babysitter for those who lack ambition. But that doesn't change the fact that you're still accepting the charity of the taxpayer. When are you coming home to do something meaningful? Asterisk, the sting never quite went away, but I learned to manage the pain. I stopped interpreting his words as parental critique and started seeing them for what they were: projections of his own deep insecurity. His world was measured by zeros in a bank account and the square footage of his latest acquisition. My world was measured by loyalty, competence, and the ability to handle pressure. I used his scorn as a financial blueprint. If he mocked my paycheck, I would ensure that paycheck was used with brutal efficiency. I became obsessive about my finances, treating my savings plan like a high-stakes mission. While Richard was busy speculating and leveraging himself to the hilt in volatile markets, I was implementing a slow, steady, and unbreakable strategy. I maxed out my contributions to the Thrift Savings Plan (TSP) from day one, locking in the government match. Deployment pay, which was often tax-exempt, went straight into high-yield accounts. I utilized every educational benefit the GI Bill offered, not just for my own degrees, but to free up cash flow for investments. I lived far below my means. I didn't buy status. I bought security. I realized the greatest financial tool I possessed, the one that would ultimately become my weapon, was the VA loan. It was a benefit earned through the service he called a refuge for losers, offering zero down payment and exceptional interest rates. Every time Richard emailed me about my meager paycheck, I mentally calculated how much closer I was to leveraging that benefit. He saw the military as a financial dead end. I saw it as a sophisticated, guaranteed path to stability. My goal wasn't just to save money. It was to build a fortress of financial independence, so robust that Richard's opinion, or his money, could never touch me again. Years turned into a decade, then 15 years. I established a life completely removed from the suffocating suburb. I had friends, colleagues, and a sense of belonging that was genuine, not manufactured by social climbing. I was stationed on the West Coast, then overseas, putting thousands of miles between myself and his toxic influence. During those years, I watched Richard's life from afar, through the filtered lens of social media and occasional news articles. His real estate empire always looked impressive on paper, but I saw the cracks. It was built on risk, leverage, and the desperate need to perpetually look richer than the next man. He was constantly chasing the next big deal, terrified of standing still. I, on the other hand, was stable. I had a clear career path, guaranteed retirement, and a burgeoning investment portfolio that grew quietly and reliably. I had chosen honor over hubris, dedication over debt. I was secure. Richard was merely posturing. The irony was not lost on me. The security he despised, the guaranteed, modest, reliable loser paycheck was providing me with a level of peace he could never attain through his reckless, high-roller ambition. I had built my life on bedrock. He had built his on shifting sand. I knew, deep down, that his foundation was brittle. And I was patiently waiting, not for him to fail, but for the moment his structure finally succumbed to the inevitable stress of his own ego. When that time came, I would be ready. I had the means, the motivation, and the financial tools, all earned through the path he had so cruelly mocked, to finally reclaim my narrative and prove the true measure of a successful life. The salt air of San Diego usually felt like a cleansing balm, but that afternoon, it carried a strange, heavy static. I was sitting in my small, impeccably organized apartment off base, reviewing flight logs, the kind of meticulous, methodical work that had become my anchor. 15 years had passed since I slammed his front door, and every day since had been a testament to the discipline he claimed I lacked. The phone rang. It wasn't a base number. It was a 203 area code, Connecticut. I hesitated. I had systematically pruned every unnecessary connection to that life, maintaining only the essential professional ties. I picked up, my voice flat and professional. Sarah, it's Jessica Thorne. Jessica. I hadn't heard that name in maybe a decade. She was the daughter of one of my father's real estate partners, someone who had always viewed my life choices with a mixture of pity and confusion. She still lived in the same gilded cage of a suburb. Jessica? To what do I owe the call? I kept my tone neutral, bracing myself for some inevitable society gossip or a veiled invitation to a wedding I wouldn't attend. What she said next hit me with the force of a sudden wave. It's about Richard, your father. It's bad, Sarah. Really bad. I felt no immediate rush of emotion, just a cold, analytical stillness. I leaned back, my chair squeaking slightly against the hardwood. Define bad, Jessica. She launched into a breathless, panicked account. The market, she explained, had turned viciously against the higher-risk, higher-reward strategy Richard had always employed. He hadn't just invested. He had gambled. He was over-leveraged, relying on inflated appraisals and constant refinancing. When the inevitable correction came, the margin calls began, and his entire empire, the one built on the illusion of invincibility, began to crumble. The house? Sarah? She whispered, the horror evident in her voice. It's going. It's a quiet, distress sale. He's trying to keep it out of the papers, but everyone knows. They're liquidating assets to stave off total ruin. I listened to the details without interrupting, my mind already shifting into operational mode. I could visualize the polished mahogany, the towering facade, the very structure that had been used as the physical manifestation of his contempt for me. He had used that house as a weapon, a symbol of his superior success, a pedestal from which to deliver his pronouncements about my loser's path. The information settled, heavy and satisfying. I finally understood the fragility of his world. My world, built on steel and service records, felt infinitely more solid than his foundation of speculative paper wealth. Thank you, Jessica, I said simply. I appreciate the heads up. I hung up the phone and stared out the window at the setting sun, illuminating the massive gray hulls of the destroyers docked nearby. For the first time since that night, I felt a genuine, unadulterated flicker of vindictive satisfaction. But I crushed it instantly. This wasn't about petty revenge. Petty revenge was transient. It evaporated into spite. This had to be permanent. This had to be about reclaiming my narrative. The house wasn't just property. It was the physical location of my defining humiliation. Buying it back wouldn't be an act of acquisition. It would be an act of exorcism. It would be the ultimate proof that the life of honor and structure he mocked had provided me with the financial security he, with all his reckless ambition, could never maintain. I needed to move fast. Distress sales are brutal. They attract predators and opportunists. If I wanted that specific piece of real estate, I had to be the most decisive, well-funded buyer on the block, and I needed to remain completely invisible until the final handshake. Richard would fight tooth and nail if he knew I was the one trying to take his ultimate status symbol. I immediately called my financial advisor, Mr. Chen, a man whose quiet competence I trusted implicitly. He specialized in military clients and understood the unique benefits and challenges of our financial structure. Mr. Chen, I began, skipping the pleasantries. I need to purchase a specific piece of residential property in Connecticut, immediately. It is a distress sale, and absolute confidentiality is paramount. I gave him the address. I could hear the sharp intake of his breath over the line. That address? That's a significant property, Commander. Are you prepared for the valuation? I am, I confirmed. I have 15 years of accumulated savings deployment pay, bonuses, the maximized TSP contributions, the whole portfolio. I need you to liquidate what is necessary for a substantial earnest money deposit. Enough to make any offer undeniable. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing my assets. Richard had always scoffed at the Navy's meager paycheck. What he failed to grasp was the power of consistency, tax-free allowances, and unparalleled benefits. While he was paying exorbitant interest rates on speculative loans, I was compounding interest and living within my means, accumulating wealth in a quiet, relentless fashion. My savings account was robust, a fortress of financial discipline. But the real weapon, the instrument of irony, was the benefit I hadn't yet fully utilized: the VA loan. This is where the service truly pays off, Commander, Mr. Chen stated, his voice now crisp with professional excitement. We can utilize your VA home loan guarantee. No private mortgage insurance, highly competitive rates, and, crucially for this market, zero down payment required if we structure it correctly. It gives us incredible flexibility and immediate liquidity. I felt a profound sense of vindication wash over me as he outlined the plan. The benefit Richard had mocked, the meager, guaranteed security of a military life, was now the sledgehammer I would use to dismantle his crumbling facade. The VA loan was a tangible reward for the service he deemed fit only for losers. I authorized Mr. Chen to proceed with the pre-qualification immediately. My next step was securing local representation. I didn't want to use anyone Richard might know, which ruled out 90% of the high-end firms in that small, interconnected suburb. I found a small, discreet law firm 20 miles away, specializing in corporate property transfers, and a real estate agent known for her discretion and efficiency rather than her high-profile listings. I flew to a regional airport in Massachusetts under the guise of an operational briefing, rented a nondescript car, and drove to meet the lawyer, Mr. Hayes, in a sterile office park far from my childhood home. I have 2 non-negotiable requirements. Mr. Hayes, I told him, pushing the signed retainer across the desk. First, we must win the bid on 4700 Sycamore Lane. Second, my identity must be completely sealed. The seller cannot know who the buyer is until the deed is signed and recorded. I want a blind trust, a dummy corporation, whatever legal shield you can erect. Hayes, a hawk-faced man who seemed to relish complexity, nodded slowly. A blind purchase of a high-profile distress asset? Understandable. We can structure the offer through a holding company based out of Delaware. The seller will only deal with the corporate entity. I provided the initial wire transfer for the earnest money, a number so high it would make any other buyer think twice. This wasn't just an offer. It was a declaration of intent. I wanted the sellers to look at my bid and see only overwhelming, immediate financial stability, something Richard was clearly lacking. The next few days were a blur of conference calls, reviewing documents, and waiting. Waiting for the counteroffers to fizzle out, waiting for the bank to approve the transfer, waiting for Richard to be forced to accept his fate. I kept the original printed copy of my VA loan pre-approval tucked securely in my briefcase. Every time I looked at the seal, the official stamp of the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, I felt the strength of my position. I spent hours alone, running simulations in my head. I wasn't buying the house to live in it. I was buying it to neutralize it, to strip it of the toxic power it held over my memory. I wasn't motivated by hate, but by a deep, unwavering commitment to self-respect. Finally, the email arrived from Mr. Hayes, late one Tuesday night. Asterisk subject: Sycamore Lane acquisition, offer accepted. Asterisk the holding company's offer, backed by my steady Navy savings and the guaranteed power of the VA loan, had been accepted. Richard had signed the contract, agreeing to sell his most prized possession to an anonymous corporate entity. He had surrendered the symbol of his life's work for a price that, while significant, represented a fraction of his inflated ego. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow breath. The transaction was set to close in 2 weeks. I felt the profound, delicious irony settle deep in my bones. The house he had kicked me out of, the house he had used to measure my worth, was now legally mine, purchased with the very funds he had labeled the loser's paycheck. The quiet accumulation of honor and discipline had finally manifested its ultimate power. The time for the final, visible confrontation was drawing near. I had built my life on bedrock. He had built his on shifting sand. And now, I was ready to claim the ground. The metallic scent of starch and freshly polished leather filled the air of the small, impersonal hotel room. I stood before the full-length mirror, running my white-gloved hand over the crisply pressed fabric of my dress uniform. This was more than clothing. It was armor forged in the crucible of dedication, discipline, and 15 years of service. Every seam, every piece of highly shined brass, every stripe and ribbon represented a victory hard won. A silent rebuttal to the man who had once dismissed my chosen path as a refuge for the weak. I had spent the entire morning in this ritualistic preparation. I ensured the creases in my trousers were sharp enough to cut glass, and I checked the alignment of my ribbons a dozen times. The gold on my shoulder boards gleamed under the hotel light, signifying the rank I had earned, a rank far exceeding the meager expectations Richard had set for me. He had projected his own shallow definition of success onto me, measuring worth only in quarterly profits and square footage. Today, I was carrying the true measure of success: competence, honor, and financial independence, secured by the very system he mocked. My heart was a steady drumbeat beneath the ceremonial jacket, not fueled by adrenaline, but by cold, calculated intention. This wasn't about rage. Rage was messy and inefficient. This was about closure, about proving that the life he had tried to extinguish had instead flourished into something formidable. I picked up the leather briefcase containing the final, notarized documents. The weight of the papers felt immense, heavier than any gear I had carried on deployment. They were the tangible proof of my vindication, the culmination of years of quiet saving and strategic planning. I paused at the door, taking a deep, steadying breath. It was time to go home, a home I had purchased with my own hands. The drive was surreal. I rented an anonymous black sedan, deliberately unremarkable, to navigate the familiar, tree-lined streets of the suburb. The neighborhood hadn't changed. The houses were still monuments to excess, their lawns meticulously manicured, their silence suffocating. I felt like an anthropologist observing a species I had long since evolved beyond. As I turned onto our street, the memories began to flood back. Not the warm, nostalgic kind, but sharp, cold flashes of humiliation. I remembered sitting in the back of the family sedan, watching other kids play, while Richard lectured me on the importance of networking before I even knew what the word meant. I remembered the heavy, oppressive expectation that defined every meal, every conversation, every choice. Then, I saw it. The house. It loomed exactly as it always had, imposing, stately, built of expensive brick and cold ambition. But something was different. The hedges surrounding the front walkway were slightly overgrown, a subtle sign of neglect that Richard, the obsessive perfectionist, would never have tolerated in his prime. The glossy, heavy oak door looked duller, lacking the polished sheen that spoke of constant, vigilant maintenance. And there, parked awkwardly in the circular driveway, was a large, rented, moving van. I pulled the sedan to the curb, a few houses down, and killed the engine. I watched the scene unfold. Richard and his current wife, a woman years younger than him, perpetually draped in designer clothes, were supervising the loading of the last few boxes. They were attempting to maintain a facade of composure. But the effort was visible in the tension of Richard's shoulders, and the forced, brittle smile his wife kept plastering on her face whenever a neighbor drove by. He looked older than I remembered, his suit perhaps a touch too loose. The sharpness of his tailored arrogance, slightly blunted by defeat. He was directing a mover with an impatient, chopping hand motion. The same gesture he used when dismissing a poorly executed business plan, or, 15 years ago, dismissing my life choices. I opened the car door. The crisp, clean air of the American suburb hit me, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint smell of diesel from the moving truck. I adjusted my cap, ensuring it was level, and began the walk. Every step I took was deliberate, measured. I wasn't just walking up a driveway. I was traversing the distance of 15 years of separation, sacrifice, and growth. I felt the weight of the rejection he had imposed on me on this very sidewalk, the night he told me I was nothing. Now, I was walking back not for reconciliation, but for finality. I reached the edge of the property, stepping onto the paving stones that led to the front porch. Richard was facing the moving van, his back to me. His wife, however, caught sight of me first. She was leaning against a large, antique chest, being loaded onto the truck, and her expression, initially bored, shifted to confusion, then mild annoyance at the sight of an unfamiliar military officer intruding on their private distress. I continued my approach. My boots made a solid, rhythmic sound on the driveway, a sound of authority that cut through the strained silence of their departure. Richard finally turned when I was only 10 feet away. He straightened his tie, automatically defaulting to the posture of the powerful businessman dealing with a service member, perhaps expecting me to be delivering a package or asking for directions. He didn't see Sarah. He saw a commander in the United States Navy. "Can I help you, Commander?" he asked, his voice retaining that familiar, condescending timbre. Even now, when he was clearly on the ropes, he didn't bother masking the impatience. "We're a bit busy here," wrapping things up. I stopped directly in front of him. I stood at attention, projecting every ounce of professional discipline I had acquired. I didn't rush the moment. I allowed him the space to look me over, to register the quality of the uniform, the rank insignia, the quiet power I radiated. His eyes scanned my face, then flicked down to my name tag. That was the moment. The instant of catastrophic recognition. The air seemed to freeze. I watched the color drain from his face, starting at the temples and sweeping down to his jawline. The forced composure shattered instantly, replaced by a mixture of shock, fury, and, beneath it all, a terrible, dawning fear. His wife gasped softly behind him, finally understanding why this officer looked so familiar. "Sarah," he whispered, the name coming out like a cough. He took a half step back, stumbling slightly on the paved surface. The arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, visceral disbelief. I didn't answer the question. I maintained eye contact, refusing to give him the comfort of the familiar daughter he had discarded. I was a professional, executing the final step of a long-term strategy. I reached into my briefcase, pulling out the stack of documents I had meticulously prepared. The finalized deed, the closing statement, and the keys to the property. I held them out to him. "Richard," I said, my voice low and steady, lacking any trace of emotion. It was the first time I had called him by his first name, stripping him of the title he had forfeited years ago. "I'm not here to help you move, I am here for the property transfer." He stared at the papers, then back at my face, trying to process the impossible equation. "Transfer? What? What are you talking about?" "The closing was finished this morning. The buyer is an LLC, some anonymous investment group." I allowed a faint, calculated smile to touch my lips. The anonymous investment group had a single principle: me. I pushed the documents slightly closer to his chest. The top sheet clearly displayed my full legal name, Sarah J. Vance, as the sole purchaser. "Effective today," I continued, my voice cutting through the sudden, horrified silence. "I am the new sole owner of 1420 Crestwood Drive. I utilized the proceeds of my military retirement account, and most significantly, a VA home loan, a benefit earned through the service you called a refuge for losers." I watched as the reality of the situation crashed over him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked down at the documents, then back at the moving van, then at the house, the symbol of his reign, now legally claimed by the daughter he had ridiculed. The victory was not in the acquisition of the house, but in the devastating, undeniable proof of my self-sufficiency. The loser's paycheck had not only secured my future, but had also bought the physical manifestation of his failure. His wife, recovering slightly, started to speak, a high-pitched, desperate sound. "Richard, tell her, this isn't possible. You can't let her do this." Richard ignored her. His eyes were locked on mine, searching for the crack, the weakness, the lingering need for his approval that he assumed still existed. He found nothing but granite. "You did this deliberately," he finally choked out, the accusation laced with outrage, not defeat. "You waited until I was exposed. Until the market, I waited until I was financially ready." I corrected him, cutting him off with the precision of a surgeon. "I waited until I had the required capital, earned through honest work and disciplined saving. I waited until my meager paycheck had accumulated enough value to purchase the very house you used to measure my inadequacy." I didn't need to yell. The quiet weight of the truth was enough. I held the keys out one last time. "These are yours no longer," I stated, my eyes commanding him to accept the reality. "You have until 1700 hours to vacate the remaining property. Any items left after that time will be considered abandoned and disposed of." I then dropped the keys into his outstretched, trembling hand. The jangle of the brass keys against the silence was the final, devastating sound of the gavel falling. The ownership had been transferred, and so had the power. I had reclaimed my dignity, and I had done it on the terms dictated by the life he had taught me to despise. My vindication was complete. I was home. Chapter 5. The true measure: the air was thick and still, heavy with the stench of Richard's shattered arrogance. The key transfer documents hung suspended between us, a thin sheaf of paper representing 15 years of calculated effort and the total collapse of his kingdom. I watched the realization flood his face. The initial shock that had frozen his features now melted into a grotesque combination of disbelief and incandescent fury. He was cornered, stripped bare. And the man holding the leash was the daughter he had dismissed as a failure, wearing the uniform he had called a costume for the unambitious. His mouth opened, but only a dry, rattling sound escaped. "Sarah, what is this? This is some kind of sick joke. You can't afford this. You can't." I didn't flinch. I kept my posture ramrod straight, the brass of my uniform gleaming in the late afternoon sun, reflecting the cold, hard certainty in my eyes. I had practiced this moment 1,000 times in the lonely hours between watches on deployment, refining the words until they were surgical strikes, devoid of unnecessary emotion. "It's no joke, Richard," I stated, my voice low and steady, carrying the authority of an officer used to giving orders, not pleading for attention. The closing was finalized an hour ago. I am the sole, registered owner of 1420 Crestwood Drive. Your lawyer has the details. He swayed slightly, gripping the lintel of the front door, the final barrier between his world and mine. His trophy wife, who had been nervously fiddling with a designer handbag near the moving truck, gasped and rushed forward, her painted facade cracking under the stress. "Richard, what is she saying? Who is this?" she demanded, looking at me with frantic confusion. Unable to reconcile the expensive uniform with the loser-daughter persona Richard had cultivated for years. He ignored her, his eyes fixed on mine, searching desperately for the loophole. The misstep, the evidence of my incompetence he always relied upon. "Where did you get the capital? Your salary, it's nothing. You have no idea what the carrying costs are here." He spat, resorting to the only weapon he had left: financial condescension. I felt a profound, satisfying calm settle over me. This was the moment of reckoning. I stepped closer, placing my polished boot on the pristine marble of the porch, staking my claim. "You are correct, Richard. My Navy salary alone wouldn't cover it," I conceded, allowing a slight, dangerous smile to touch my lips. "But you neglected to factor in 15 years of disciplined saving, maximized retirement contributions, and the substantial educational benefits I utilized to secure a second income stream. You see, while you were gambling on volatile markets and leveraging everything you owned for superficial status, I was building a fortress of stability." I paused, letting the weight of my next statement sink in, letting the irony burn him. "And then there's the final piece of the puzzle. The VA loan," I finished, emphasizing the acronym he would recognize as belonging to the military infrastructure he so brutally mocked. 100% financing, 0 down payment, guaranteed by the very institution you called a refuge for the weak. It's a benefit earned through dedicated service. A benefit you ensured I would qualify for the day you kicked me out." I straightened to my full height, the silver eagles on my shoulders catching the light. I delivered the line I had carried like a shield and a weapon for half my life. Asterisk, asterisk. My father said the Navy was for losers. Well, Richard, this loser's paycheck was more than enough to buy back my dignity and the house you used as a weapon. Asterisk, asterisk. The air went dead silent again, save for the faint whir of the moving van idling down the street. His face, already pale, seemed to deflate. The arrogance, the defining characteristic of his entire life, finally shattered. It was not the loss of the house that broke him. It was the realization that the life path he had sneered at the path of duty, structure, and reliable security had proven fundamentally superior to his reckless, entitled ambition. He didn't have a comeback. The man who always had a cutting remark, a dismissive wave, or a patronizing lecture was rendered speechless by undeniable fact. I didn't linger to gloat. That wasn't my style, and it wasn't the goal. My objective was vindication, not cruelty. I turned slightly toward the lawyer, a nervous man who had been silently witnessing the destruction of his client's ego. "Mr. Harrison, please ensure that the remaining boxers are secured and moved by 1700 hours. The property must be completely vacated by then." I then dropped the heavy brass keys into Richard's outstretched, trembling hand. The jangle against the silence was the final, devastating sound of the gavel falling. I watched them leave. Richard's wife steered him toward the passenger seat of their luxury sedan, which now looked pitifully small next to the imposing structure of the house. He moved like a puppet whose strings had been cut, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the ground. He never once looked back at me, standing sentinel on the porch. The refusal to acknowledge me, even in defeat, was his final, futile act of contempt. But his contempt no longer had purchase. As the car pulled away, disappearing around the manicured corner, I felt a physical pressure lift from my chest, a weight I hadn't realized I had carried since that cold night 15 years ago. The shadow of his scorn was gone. I stood there for a long minute, just breathing the suburban air that was now mine. Then, I turned and used my own key to open the massive mahogany door. The house was cold and echoey. Richard and his wife had taken every piece of furniture that wasn't bolted down, leaving cavernous, dust-laden spaces. The rooms were stripped bare, devoid of the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had defined my childhood. The polished floors reflected the sunlight in long, empty streaks. It wasn't a home yet. It was a shell, waiting to be filled with a life built on integrity. I walked slowly through the entrance hall, running my hand along the cold marble banister. I remembered how small I used to feel here, how every step echoed Richard's expectations, and how terrified I was of disappointing him. Now, my boots clicked confidently on the floorboards, the sound of an owner inspecting her property, not a child fearing punishment. I moved into the dining room. This was the scene of the crime. The polished mahogany table where I had presented my enlistment papers on my 18th birthday. I could almost hear the ghost of his explosive laughter, the mocking tone as he branded me a failure. I walked to the head of the table where he used to sit, the seat of his power, and simply stood there. The space was empty. The power was gone. I wasn't angry. I felt a deep, cleansing peace. The house hadn't been an object of revenge. It had been the necessary stage for reclaiming my narrative. By purchasing it, I hadn't just bought 4 walls. I had purchased the right to rewrite the most humiliating scene of my life. I continued my tour, moving into what had been his study room, always smelling of expensive leather and stale cigar smoke, where he conducted the real business of the world. He had once told me I didn't have the stomach for real ambition, that I was destined for a life of mediocrity, counting pennies. I looked around the empty shelves and the faint rectangle on the wall where his portrait had hung. I thought about my own ambition, to serve with distinction, to lead competently, and to build a life so financially sound that no external force could ever threaten my security again. My ambition wasn't loud or speculative. It was quiet, relentless, and built brick by brick with earned resources. I realized the profound irony. Richard had spent his entire adult life chasing the illusion of wealth, building a fragile empire on debt and ego. When the market shifted, his foundation crumbled. He valued status over substance. I, on the other hand, had valued stability and competence above all else. The Navy had taught me the discipline to survive in extreme conditions, both financial and physical. That discipline was what saved me, and now it had bought his house. I sat down on the floor in the middle of the empty living room, the room where holiday gatherings were held, where I was always the awkward outsider, the disappointment. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows. I thought about the loser's paycheck. That paycheck, combined with the comprehensive benefits package of military service, represented more than just money. It represented a contract or promise of security and opportunity in exchange for dedication and honor. Every promotion, every deployment bonus, every educational grant was earned through sweat, risk, and adherence to a code of conduct Richard could never understand. His wealth was a house of cards. My wealth, my true wealth, was the character I had forged. I looked up at the high ceiling. This house was no longer a monument to his success or my humiliation. It was a monument to my resilience. It was proof that the values he scorned honor, dedication, and service had provided me with the security he could never achieve through reckless ambition. I didn't need to renovate immediately. I just needed to be here, to feel the space change, to absorb the victory, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of self-completion. I was finally home, on my own terms, in a life that was entirely, immutably mine. My life was well lived. That was the only measure that mattered now. I stood up, feeling the solid floor beneath my feet, grounded and secure. I was an officer, a homeowner, and, most importantly, I was finally free. The true measure of success wasn't the size of the house, but the strength of the foundation beneath a foundation I had built myself, far away from the shadow of his contempt. I smiled, turning toward the window, ready for the first sunset in my new home.